Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. I just came back from Iceland and today I want to show you a photography technique I used a lot while traveling there. Today I'm going to talk about HDR photos. So what is HDR? HDR stands for high dynamic range, and what dynamic range is pretty easy to explain if you look at an example. So if you look at this photo, you probably have made the same experience that if you point your camera at a very bright sky or a sunset, you will see that the sky is exposed very well, but the shadows are very dark and don't have any detail. When you have low dynamic range, you have a lot of detail in the sky and in the highlights, but very little detail in the shadows and the darker parts. If you have high dynamic range, you have a lot of detail in the highlights and a lot of detail in the low light and shadow areas. So how do we get this high dynamic range? If you shoot raw, it's very easy to just bring down the highlights and bring up the shadows, and you have a lot higher dynamic range. But how can we take this to an extreme if we want even more dynamic range? Here in Lightroom I have a sequence of 8 photos. They're all taken at Gullfoss in Iceland, and they're long exposures I took with a tripod and an ND filter. You can see that they're all taken at different exposures. I started at 1/3 of a second and I went higher, or I exposed longer to make the image brighter, until I had a lot of detail in the shadows and no detail in the highlights. But I have this image, or multiple darker images, where I have a lot of detail in the highlights but no detail in the darker areas. Now what we're gonna do is merge these photos together, and we're gonna take, or Lightroom is automatically gonna take, the good details out of the sky and the highlights and merge it with the good details out of the shadows, and so we have a really high dynamic range in one image. So to do that, we're gonna select the first photo, hold shift and click the last to select them all. Now we're either gonna hit Ctrl H or Command H on a Mac, or right click and photo merge to HDR. Now it's gonna create an HDR preview, and you're gonna wanna have these two options enabled, and also you wanna look at the deghost amount. If it doesn't look right and you have weird lines at moving parts, if you have some moving parts in your image, it might be that it looks weird, and then just go higher with the deghost amount. I'm just gonna leave it on low because I think it's gonna be fine, because we don't have that many moving parts in this image. So Lightroom is done with building our HDR image, and you can see that we have a lot of detail in the highlights and a lot of detail in the shadow parts, but we are having some weird stuff in the cloud of vapor here, so we're gonna go up with the deghost amount and it's gonna rebuild the preview. Okay, our HDR preview is done and we don't have these weird effects anymore, and if you still have weird effects, just go up with the deghost amount again, and you also have this checkbox to see where there are moving parts and where the deghosting takes place. And now we just hit merge. So the HDR image has been merged. I don't know why that took so long. My computer is pretty slow because I'm recording at the same time. But we have a lot of detail in the highlights and in the clouds, and a lot of detail in the shadows. Now you can just go to develop and edit as you like. Lightroom already picked a few settings here while making the high dynamic range photo, and now we can just edit as we like. Make sure to always check remove chromatic aberrations under lens corrections when making an HDR image, because sometimes you get chromatic aberrations when Lightroom merges the images. And chromatic aberrations are like colorful lines along some lines in the image, and they don't look good, so just check that and you're gonna be on the safe side. And we are done. Here we have our finished image, and I got rid of all the tourists and just did some basic editing, and it looks great. We have a very high dynamic range. This is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that this helped you and you can create some awesome HDR images in the future with this technique. If you liked this video, why don't you leave a like on this video, and you can subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye bye.